Jannik Sinner sat in the dimly lit interview room, his head bowed, hands clasped tightly as if holding back a storm within. The muffled murmurs from outside barely seeped through the thick walls, but he knew the whispers were about him. They always were. For years, he had swallowed his words, buried his frustrations deep down, and let his racket speak for him. But today was different. Today, he had reached his breaking point. It had started innocently enough. The media loved the narrative of him and Carlos Alcaraz as the future of tennis, two young prodigies with immense talent and unquenchable hunger for victory. The world lapped up the story of their friendly rivalry, but Sinner knew better. Beneath the thin veneer of mutual respect, there was an undercurrent of tension that neither could fully deny. While Carlos's meteoric rise to superstardom captivated fans and media alike, Jannik had toiled away in the shadows, perfecting his craft with quiet determination. Carlos, ever the crowd pleaser, thrived in the spotlight, his matches hailed as electrifying and groundbreaking. Sinner, in contrast, often found himself cast as the perennial challenger, the other guy in their narrative. When the cameras started rolling, Jannik took a deep breath, his piercing blue eyes scanning the sea of reporters before him. This was his moment to finally speak his truth. "Everyone keeps asking me about Carlos," he began, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "They want to know if we're friends, if I admire him, if his success inspires me. For years, I've smiled and said the right things. But honestly, I'm tired of pretending." The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Even the most seasoned journalists, accustomed to canned responses, leaned forward, their pens poised, sensing this was something different. "Can I respect Carlos as a player?" "Yes," Jannik continued, his tone firm. "But what you see on the court isn't the whole story. Behind the scenes, things are different. Very different." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. The reporters exchanged glances, their curiosity now fully piqued. "Do you know what it feels like," he said, his voice rising slightly, "to give everything you have, day after day, only to be constantly compared to someone else? To be told, you're good, but not as good as him, or that your achievements don't matter because they don't shine as brightly as his. It's exhausting." Jannik's hands clenched into fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've worked harder than I can even explain. I've sacrificed everything. Time with my family, my personal life, even my health, just to be here. And yet, no matter what I do, it's never enough. Carlos is the golden boy, the one everyone loves. He gets the attention, the praise, the opportunities, while I'm left in the shadows." A reporter tentatively raised a hand. "Are you saying Alcaraz has been unfairly favored, or is this more about your perception of his success?" Sinner shook his head, his voice tinged with exasperation. "It's not just perception, it's reality. Do you know how many tournaments I've played where the organizers clearly prioritized him? How many times I've been scheduled on the smaller courts while he plays on the main stage, even when our rankings were neck and neck? They market him as the future of tennis as if I don't even exist." Leaning forward, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "And then there's the personal side of it. You all think Carlos is this humble guy, that's what he shows you. But behind closed doors, it's not always the case. There have been moments, comments he's made, things he's done that make me question everything. Like the time he told me, right after a close match, that I'd never be able to handle the pressure of the big stage the way he does. Or how he laughs off my efforts, like I'm just a stepping stone on his path to greatness." The raw honesty in Jannik's words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered. This wasn't just a competitive outburst, it was a young man laying bare years of pent-up frustration and disillusionment. Another journalist broke the silence. "Why now?" they asked. "Why speak up today?" Jannik ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Because I've reached my breaking point. I can't keep suppressing this. It's affecting my game, my mindset, my life. I thought that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet, and let my tennis do the talking, things would change. But they haven't. And I'm done waiting." He turned to face the cameras directly, addressing not just the reporters in the room but the entire world watching from home. "I'm not saying all this to gain sympathy or to tear Carlos down. I'm saying it because it's my truth. And for the first time, I'm not afraid to tell it." Jannik Sinner stood at the edge of his vulnerability, his emotions raw and exposed in a way he'd never allowed before. The conference room, dimly lit and heavy with the weight of his words, was silent, so silent it felt as though even the walls were holding their breath. For the first time in years, Jannik wasn't speaking through carefully chosen phrases designed to appease the media or maintain an image. Instead, he was speaking his truth, a truth that had been buried beneath years of composure and relentless effort. "I just want people to understand what it's like," Jannik said, his voice steady yet tinged with an ache that resonated deeply. "Even at the highest level, we're still human. We have doubts, insecurities, and struggles. And sometimes, you need to speak your truth, even if it makes others uncomfortable. As the press conference came to an end, Jannik rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried. For the first time in years, his shoulders felt lighter, as though the burden he'd carried silently had been lifted. He knew the fallout would be intense: headlines dissecting his words, fans fiercely defending Carlos Alcaraz, and endless debates over what he had said. But for once, Jannik didn't care. He had spoken his truth, and that to him was all that mattered. As he walked out of the room, the air seemed fresher, his steps more assured. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter. One where he could play not for validation from others but for himself. For Jannik Sinner, this was liberation. When Jannik stepped off the modest platform where he had delivered his heartfelt revelations, the atmosphere in the room was thick, almost suffocating. It was as if time had momentarily frozen, the gravity of his statements anchoring everyone in place. Reporters, usually quick to fire off follow-up questions, hesitated, caught between their professional instincts and the emotional depth of what they just witnessed. Jannik slumped back into his chair, his exhaustion evident, but his resolve unshaken. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on his brow under the unforgiving lights, yet his piercing gaze betrayed no regret. The silence broke when a seasoned journalist cleared his throat, his tone measured but probing. "Jannik, you've just said things few athletes dare to say publicly. You mentioned Carlos making comments. Can you elaborate? Are you suggesting this goes beyond simple competitive banter?" Jannik's lips tightened briefly, and for a moment, it seemed he might retreat into the safety of silence. But the floodgates had been opened, and there was no going back. Leaning forward, his forearms resting on the table, his fingers intertwined, he began, "Look, we're all competitors out there. Trash talk, mind games, that's part of the sport. But there's a line, and Carlos crosses it more often than people realize. It's subtle, so subtle that most wouldn't notice unless they were in my position." He exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of pent-up frustration. "It's the way he smiles at me after a tough loss, not in solidarity, but as if he enjoys watching me struggle. Or how he casually brings up moments where he's beaten me during casual conversations, like it's just another reminder of how much better he is. And then there are the backhanded compliments. He'll say things like, 'You're so consistent, Jannik. You'll probably have a long career, even if you never win a Grand Slam.' It's not what he says, it's how he says it." The room hung on his every word, the tension palpable. Another journalist, emboldened by Sinner's candor, leaned forward, recorder in hand. "Have you ever confronted him about this? Or shared your feelings with someone on your team?" Jannik shook his head, a bitter smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "No, and honestly, I don't think it would change anything. Carlos is charismatic. He knows how to charm people. Even if I called him out, he'd laugh it off, make it seem like I'm overreacting. Maybe even turn it into a joke. That's his gift. He's always in control of the narrative." He paused, the weight of his thoughts visible on his face. "And then there's the media. Everyone loves him, don't they?" His voice carried a sharper edge now, causing some journalists to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "He's the chosen one. The guy who plays with flair, fights for every point like it's his last. Sure, he deserves credit for that. But what about me? I've worked just as hard, maybe harder, yet I'm constantly overlooked." The silence that followed was deafening. Jannik's words weren't just a critique of his rival, they were an indictment of the entire system. A system that had elevated one player to near mythical status while seemingly sidelining another. This wasn't jealousy, it was a plea for fairness, for recognition of his sacrifices and struggles. A young journalist, her voice trembling slightly, broke the tension. "Jannik, do you think this rivalry has pushed you to improve, or has it created more pressure than motivation?" The question caught Jannik off guard. He straightened in his seat, his expression softening as he considered his response. "Both," he admitted after a moment. "Carlos pushes me, there's no denying that. Every time I see him win, it lights a fire in me. But that fire isn't always healthy. It's not just about wanting to be better. It's about proving people wrong, proving that I belong. And that kind of pressure, it eats away at you." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm chasing something I'll never catch. If no matter how hard I work, how many matches I win, I'll always be the other guy. The one who's good, but not great. And that's a hard thing to live with." The room remained still, the weight of Sinner's vulnerability pressing down on everyone present. Finally, a veteran journalist broke the silence, his voice gentle but inquisitive. "Jannik, you've shared so much about your perspective. But do you think Carlos knows how you feel? Does he see you as a rival in the same way you see him?" Jannik let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head.
Honestly, I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not.
Carlos is in his own world. He probably thinks we're just competitors, nothing more. And maybe that's part of the problem. He doesn't see how his actions, his words, affect me. Or maybe he does, and he just doesn't care. Either way, it doesn't change how I feel. The room fell silent once more. For years, the rivalry between Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz had been painted as a story of mutual respect and friendly competition. But now, the cracks in that facade were laid bare, revealing the raw emotions and unspoken truths simmering beneath the surface. Jannik leaned back in his chair, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had said what needed to be said, and while he knew the fallout would be intense, he had no regrets. For the first time in years, he felt free from the weight of expectations, free from the need to conform, free to be himself, flaws and frustrations and all. And for Jannik Sinner, that was enough. Jannik Sinner sat still, his eyes fixed on the ground, as though the weight of his words and the room's silence had tethered him to the moment. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, every breath measured, every glance heavy with curiosity. A reporter's hesitant voice broke the quiet, laced with caution yet laced with an earnest desire for understanding. Jannik, you've described Carlos as someone who thrives under the spotlight, someone who plays for the crowd. But there are fans who see you differently. They see you as the quieter, hard-working alternative, someone who embodies a different kind of greatness. Do you ever feel like those fans are overlooked? Sinner's expression softened slightly, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face as he considered the question. I do, he admitted, his voice tinged with sincerity. And I appreciate them more than I can ever express. They're the ones who remind me why I started this journey in the first place. But even then, it sometimes feels like they're cheering for me because I'm not Carlos, rather than for who I truly am. Like I'm the antithesis to him, rather than my own person. And that's hard to accept. He paused, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as if searching for the right words. But I don't blame the fans. I blame the narrative that's been built around us. This idea that there has to be a hero, a chosen one, and if you're not that person, then you're just a supporting character in someone else's story. The room grew even quieter, the gravity of Sinner's words settling deeply. A seasoned journalist, known for his sharp yet empathetic questions, leaned forward, his tone both inquisitive and respectful. Jannik, do you think this rivalry, this narrative, has affected your relationship with Carlos off the court? Or was there never much of a relationship to begin with? Jannik's gaze flickered briefly, something unreadable crossing his face. We were never close, he admitted, his voice steady but reflective. Not really. In the beginning, when we were both breaking onto the scene, there was this mutual respect, or at least, I thought there was. But as time went on, it became clear we were on very different paths. He hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. Carlos isn't a bad person, but he's calculated. He knows how to present himself, how to say the right things to the right people. And I guess I just don't operate that way. I've always been more direct, more honest, maybe to a fault. Sinner leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. There's one moment that sticks with me, he continued, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were speaking to himself. We were in a players' meeting, and someone brought up an issue about scheduling fairness. I spoke up, said my piece. Carlos just smiled. Not in solidarity, but almost condescendingly. Like he knew none of it mattered because the system would always work in his favor. And it does. There was a bitterness in his tone, but also a hint of sadness, a recognition that at one point, he might have hoped for something different. I don't know, he said finally, his voice tinged with resignation. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe this is just what it's like at the top. But sometimes I feel so alone. Like no matter how hard I fight, I'm always fighting alone. Another journalist, emboldened by Sinner's emotional honesty, spoke up. Jannik, you've been incredibly open about your frustrations and your perspective. But what do you think Carlos would say if he were sitting here right now? Do you think he's aware of how you feel? Sinner let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking his head. If he's aware, he doesn't show it, he said, his tone flat. Carlos, he's confident. He probably thinks everything's fine, that this rivalry is exactly what it seems on the surface. And maybe that's the difference between us. He's comfortable in his role, in his position. I'm not. His voice softened, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to the room. But maybe that's why I had to say all of this. Not for him, not for the media, but for me. Because I can't keep pretending I'm okay with how things are. I'm not. And I shouldn't have to be. The room fell silent again, the weight of Sinner's confession pressing heavily on everyone present. For years, the rivalry between him and Carlos Alcaraz had been celebrated as a testament to the future of tennis. But now, it was clear that beneath the surface lay a much more complicated story. One of frustration, ambition, and the relentless pressure of living in someone else's shadow. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as if every word Jannik had spoken added another layer of gravity. His presence, though understated, demanded attention. This wasn't the polished professionalism journalists were accustomed to. This was a young athlete shedding his armor and revealing the raw truth of what it felt like to compete at the highest level, not just against an opponent, but against a narrative. A younger journalist, visibly nervous, tentatively raised her hand. "Jannik, you mentioned that Carlos is calculated, someone who knows how to control the narrative. Do you think that's part of what makes him so successful? And do you think you could ever adopt a similar approach?" Jannik's lips twisted into what might have been a smirk, though it lacked any real humor. "It's definitely part of what makes him successful," he admitted. "Carlos is charismatic, there's no denying that. He knows how to win people over, both on and off the court. He's magnetic. I've seen how that works in his favor, how sponsors line up, how fans rally behind him. It's impressive, honestly." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the table absent-mindedly. "But could I ever be like that? No. That's not who I am. And even if I tried, I think people would see through it immediately. I'm not the guy who puts on a big smile for the cameras after a loss or cracks jokes at a press conference to win people over. I'm not Carlos. I'm Jannik. And for some reason, that's never felt like it's enough." The younger journalist nodded, her pen scribbling furiously as Sinner's words poured out. But Jannik wasn't finished. His voice grew quieter now, more introspective, as though he were letting the room glimpse a part of himself he rarely showed. "I don't play for the spotlight. I don't play for the applause. I play because I love the game. But when someone like Carlos comes along, it makes you question if that's enough anymore. If just loving the game is enough to survive in this world." He paused, his gaze distant. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm chasing something I'll never catch." Jannik Sinner sat at the edge of his chair, his hands clasped tightly as though holding onto an invisible anchor. His voice, quiet yet laden with a melancholic weight, broke the silence that had enveloped the room. "There's something about Carlos," he began, his tone introspective, almost wistful. "After a match, no matter how intense it was, he always seems untouched, like it didn't really affect him. Even when he loses, it's as if he can just shrug it off and move forward. And I envy that, I really do. Because for me, every match feels like a war, not just against my opponent, but against myself, against expectations, against everything." He paused, exhaling deeply, his shoulders sinking slightly under the invisible burden he carried. "When I lose, it stays with me. It eats at me. And sometimes, I wonder if that's why he's been able to rise so quickly, because he doesn't carry the same weight I do." The room, filled with seasoned journalists, remained completely still, their pens hovering midair as they absorbed his words. Sinner's voice took on a darker, more frustrated edge, tinged with years of unspoken feelings bubbling to the surface. "And that's the thing," he continued, his tone sharpening. "It's not just that he plays the game better, he plays everything better. The media, the fans, the politics of the sport, it's like he was built for this. And me? I'm just trying to keep up." A veteran journalist, his graying hair a testament to years spent navigating the world of professional tennis, leaned forward, his voice deliberate yet compassionate. "Jannik, it sounds like you're carrying a lot of emotional weight in this rivalry. Do you think that's something Carlos even considers? Or do you believe he sees it as just another part of the competition?" Jannik inhaled deeply, as though summoning the strength to respond. His shoulders sagged slightly, the vulnerability in his posture unmistakable. "Honestly, I don't think he gives it much thought," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Carlos is laser-focused. He's always looking ahead, to the next match, the next title, the next milestone. That's part of what makes him so good. But it also makes him distant. He doesn't see the ripple effects of what he does, or if he does, he doesn't let it bother him. Meanwhile, I'm here carrying all this." He gestured vaguely, his hands attempting to encapsulate the tangled mess of emotions he struggled to articulate. "I don't think he's malicious. He doesn't set out to make me feel this way. But that almost makes it harder, because it means it's not about him, it's about me. About how I handle it. And right now, I'm not handling it well." A younger journalist, perhaps emboldened by the emotional depth of Sinner's honesty, leaned forward. "Jannik, you've spoken a lot about the pressures of being compared to Carlos. But do you ever think about what it would be like if the roles were reversed? If you were the one in the spotlight and he was the one chasing you?" Jannik's eyes flickered with a glimmer of curiosity, perhaps even longing. "I think about that all the time," he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of something bittersweet. I wonder what it would feel like to be the one everyone talks about, the one who gets the benefit of the doubt, the one who's celebrated instead of scrutinized. But then I ask myself if I'd really want that. Because with the spotlight comes pressure, expectations, this constant need to perform. And maybe I'd crumble under that too. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to some distant point in the room as though lost in thought. But I guess what I really want isn't to take Carlos's place.
I don't want to be him.
I just want to feel like what I do matters. Like I'm not invisible. Like I'm more than just the guy who plays well against Alcaraz. Because that's what it feels like sometimes, that my entire career is defined by him. Even when he's not on the court, it's like he's always there. The room fell silent once again, the weight of Jannik's vulnerability pressing heavily on everyone present. Some journalists exchanged uneasy glances, clearly grappling with how to respond. Finally, one of them spoke, their voice steady yet gentle. "Jannik, you've given us a lot of insight into how you feel. But do you think there's a way forward? A way to move past all of this and focus on your own journey, regardless of what Carlos is doing?" Jannik considered the question, his expression thoughtful, almost pensive. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of years of introspection.
I wish I did.
Part of me thinks I just need to block it all out, focus on myself, on my game. But that's easier said than done. Because every time I step onto the court, every time I hear my name, it's always followed by his. It's like he's always there, even when he's not. His voice softened, dropping to almost a whisper. But maybe that's the challenge I need to face. Not Carlos but myself. Maybe I need to figure out how to let go of all this baggage, to stop comparing myself to him, to anyone. Because at the end of the day, the only person I'm really competing against is me. The room remained still once more, the weight of Sinner's words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. For years, the world had celebrated the rivalry between Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz as a testament to the future of tennis. But now, it was clear that beneath the surface lay a far more complex story. A story of struggle, ambition, and the relentless pressure of living in someone else's shadow. Jannik's presence, though understated, commanded attention. His words had stripped away the polished veneer of professional sports, revealing the raw and often painful reality of competing not just against an opponent, but against an entire narrative. Another journalist, younger and visibly nervous, raised their hand tentatively. "Jannik, you mentioned that Carlos is calculated, someone who knows how to control the narrative. Do you think that's part of what makes him so successful? And could you ever adopt a similar approach?" Jannik's lips curved into a faint, almost ironic smile. "It's definitely part of what makes him successful," he acknowledged. "Carlos is charismatic, there's no denying that. He knows how to draw people in, both on and off the court. He's magnetic. I've seen how it works in his favor, how sponsors flock to him, how fans rally behind him. It's impressive, honestly." He paused, tracing the edge of the table with his fingers absent-mindedly. "But could I ever be like that? No. That's not who I am. And even if I tried, people would see through it immediately. I'm not the guy who puts on a big smile for the cameras after a loss or cracks jokes to charm the room. I'm not Carlos. I'm Jannik. And for some reason, that's never felt like it's enough." His voice grew softer now, more introspective, as though he were letting the room into a part of himself he rarely revealed. "I don't play for the spotlight. I don't play for the applause. I play because I love the game. But sometimes I wonder if that's enough anymore. If just loving the game is enough to survive in this world." His gaze drifted again, his expression distant. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm chasing something I'll never catch.